Hi everyone, and welcome to our third session of our professional development course. If you see me looking down, it's because I have my notes here, but this session is about sketching an annual plan. So before we do that, we are going to talk about what a diagnostic test is. And obviously, the name is pretty much self-explanatory. First of all, it is diagnostic, and then it's a test. So it's doing a diagnosis of our students, and it is a test. Since it is a test, it should follow all the directions given by Inspección de Inglés. That means in terms of the criteria to correct, in terms of the number of exercises or tasks or activities, and obviously the layout of the test. Then it says that it measures the student's knowledge. And let's see this. Let's imagine our students are in second grade. If you read the syllabus from first grade, there is something called perfil de egreso. That is the exiting profile. So what you have to do when you plan your diagnostic test for second grade is to see if the students in second grade fit that criteria. So for example, in first, after they finish first grade, they need to know or they need to distinguish certain sounds. Okay, so in your listening part, you need to check that. The other thing is that obviously a diagnostic test diagnoses where the students are. I mean, at which level they are. But what happens in first grade? First grade is, as its name says, the first grade they are receiving English. So since it is the first grade they receive English, what you are going to check is not if they know English. What you are going to check is how aware they are about English around them. For example, if they know that the word goalkeeper comes from English, if they know that the word cyber cafe comes from English, if they know that the word corner comes from English. So what they are going to do is to, or what you are going to do is to check if the students are aware of the English surrounding them. So then, obviously, one of the things you are going to receive from this diagnostic test is the deficiencies. So you are going to know in which area or areas your students are weak. So in which areas you need to work more. You need to empower those students. But be careful, because when you find that the student is not very strong in this area or in that area, you are not going to take 1 or 2 months to do this, to strengthen those students in that area. What you are going to do is to use that information for the whole year. So you are going to be cyclical in the way you teach. You are going to teach a little bit in the first unit, then a little bit in the second unit, a little bit in the third unit, and you are going to permanently recycle what you have. So this is more or less what a diagnostic test is. But one of my concerns, and one of the things I have seen in my experience, is that we don't know what to do with those results. And why I'm saying this? Because when I was a PAD and I was looking at my colleagues' register books, what I saw is that some people have like beautiful graphs. They have colors. They say, well, I have 10 students that are sufficient, 20 students that are insufficient, 10 students that know that had an acceptable mark in writing, 5 that have a non-acceptable mark in writing. But what's next? What do they do with that marking? What do they do with that information? One of the things we need to realize is that this information is very useful for us to teach. So if I find that my students are weak in writing, what is the impact of that on my plan, on my annual plan? The impact is that I'm going to work on writing strategy, writing skills, writing techniques. So I need to incorporate that information into my annual plan. So the third slide says, when we know what the students' deficiencies are, we can start drafting our annual plan. Why? Because on the one hand, I know what Inspección wants. On the other hand, I know where my students are. And obviously, and I have two hands, but let's imagine that this is the other part. And I know what my philosophy of teaching is. Remember what we did in our first session. What is my philosophy of teaching? How do I want to teach? What are my ideas about teaching? What are my beliefs? What type of learner do I want to have? So I have the type of learner, my philosophy of teaching that is represented in me. Then I have obviously what Inspección wants, that you can find it in the syllabus. And then you have your students' interests, deficiencies, priorities, everything from the diagnostic test. So what I want you to do is to analyze your diagnostic test. And even though it's not a task for this session, I am more than happy if you want to do this activity as an extra activity just to know what you are doing. I mean, I'm going to analyze a test, sorry. And if you want to analyze one test alone or in groups, I will be more than happy to help you understand why you are analyzing what you are analyzing. So in slide number 4, what I did, I put some questions to help you analyze the different activities. And the first question says, what does the activity measure? This is a basic question, but if you ask yourself, what am I measuring with this activity? Sometimes we do or we create the exercises just because we are asked to do it. But we are not actually thinking, I want to do this activity here, or I want to test my students with this activity because I want to do this. How many times do we think of that? Then, when we know how to do it, or when we know what we want, it's very difficult to be fair and to create a new activity. Why? Because in general, and I would say always, we have to evaluate our students in the way we teach. So for example, I have some kind of crazy ideas whenever I teach. So can my test be traditional orthodox? Not in a million years, because what I have to do is to be coherent. So if I am kind of crazy when I teach, have to be kind of crazy when I test. That means that I have to be creative, and that creativity needs to be put into my test. The second question is, what skills do the student need to know to perform well? And this is another very important question. Why? Because maybe you ask your students to write about their favorite actor, their favorite singer, their favorite personality. In order to do that, they need to have certain skills, like, for example, to write a biography or to write about someone or to write in the past. Do they have those skills? Maybe yes, maybe not. We need to think about this. Next, how am I going to assess students' performance? So, and this is a very crucial question. What happens if in a reading comprehension activity, the student writes wonderful things, but full of mistakes, full of spelling, grammar mistakes. Am I going to give a full mark? Am I going to deduce some or to deduct some marking from that? I don't think so, because our aim is communication. We are in a communicative approach. So I'm not going to deduct any mark from grammar. And which strategies are being tested? And I have an example. I have an example of test that is not the best test. On the contrary, it's a test that I have a lot of criticism about. But I want you to analyze it because actually it is a diagnostic test that was administered in one of our provinces. So it is something that is good, that you may encounter, especially when you are when you are trying to reach a consensus and when you are trying to create tests with teachers, with instructors from the same level. So let's go to the first slide that says listening. And first of all, when we talk about listening, I mean, it is very important that the activity is a listening comprehension activity. And when I say listening comprehension activity, that means that I need to listen to a recording, I need to listen to a text in order to do the activity. If I tell you, for example, the capital city of Uruguay is, and I write a slide, do I need to listen to complete the gap? Obviously not. So in this case, it's not a listening comprehension activity. Why? Because the information is in the person. Because the information is well known, the information is shared. For example, if I say, Tom is 15 years old. Tom is a teenager. Is it difficult to understand the word teenager? Not so much. So what you have to do is to make it meaningful. So the students need to listen in order to complete the gaps. Another thing that sometimes happens is that, especially when you give a multiple choice activity, is that you use a lot of homophones and homographs. And what's the problem here? The problem is that if you use homophones, is there any clue that the students understand? For example, if you use the word here, and the word here, the sound is the same. So are you actually testing listening? You are not testing listening in that case. What you are testing is if the student knows the word. And actually, in that case, the student does not need to listen. The student just reads the options and just completes. So be very careful about listening because in my opinion and in my experience, listening comprehension activities are the most difficult to design. Okay, so in this case, well, one of the tips I'm giving you is what I have told you, is that some gaps can be completed without listening. So actually those gaps are not part of a listening activity. Those gaps are just checking the student's culture, checking the student general understanding. So in this case, remember the four questions we had. The four questions we had were. The first one, what does the activity measure? Okay, so the reason I stated for this first one, for this first exercise, is that the teacher seems to be using a bottom-up technique. What is a bottom-up technique? A bottom-up technique is a technique in which all the information is in the text. The same here, all the information is in what I'm listening. So that means that, for example, if I tell you, okay, my name is Aldo. My name is Aldo. And the question in your listening is what the speaker's name? So do they need to elaborate something? No, they just need to listen and listen to my name. My name is Aldo, so they write Aldo. And this is a bottom-up activity. This is a bottom-up technique. A bottom-up technique is when there is all the information is in the text. Whereas a top-down technique is a type of technique in which um, the student needs to use his or her experience in order to answer the question. And I gave you an example here, I think. For example, when you say, Juan was born in 1980. How old is Juan? Is the answer in the text? No. However, the experience of the student is telling the student that since the person was born in 1980, if I if I make a calculation, I know the age. So I say 2013 minus 1980, that means 33. So what I'm going to answer is 33. I hope this idea of bottom-up and top-down techniques is clear. One of the things is that you need to strike a balance. You need to strike a balance between using bottom-up and top-down techniques. And my suggestion, and this is very personal, is that when you are in first grade, the balance should be on bottom-up. That means that there should be probably more questions that are bottom-up than top-down. But little by little, you need to go into top-down techniques. So in this case, what is the skill that you are using? Obviously is listening, but the sub-skill is identifying information. So you are not doing, what you are doing is just spotting the name, Aldo. So in this case, what you are doing is just identifying. And then what about the assessment? The assessment, this is another very important aspect, the assessment. Why? Because sometimes happens that you or we put complicated words. And I gave you the example of started. If I say started and the student writes started, is perfectly correct because if I say started, does it sound as started? Obviously. So if you read the word and the word sounds similar or the same, like in this case, as the word that it should be in the blank, you are going to write that that answer is correct. Why is correct? Because what you are checking, what you are testing, what you are evaluating is listening. You are not checking spelling. You are checking listening. So what is the strategy here? The strategy can be predicting, can be identifying, because the students are predicting some information from the text. Let's move on to reading. And here in reading, we are going to have the same idea. I mean, bottom-up and top-down strategies. In this case, the first exercise is a true or false activity and then says correct the false statements. So if you read the sentences, for example, Joshua was born in England, you can identify that in this case is a bottom-up technique question. Why? Because the actually the information is true or false, but there is no elaboration. Well, and the same happens with most of them. So in this case, I give you the same tip. When working with reading comprehension, you need to balance bottom-up and top-down strategies. And I gave you an example there. So the reason here, or so what is the activity measuring? In this case, all the information is in the text. So what you are doing basically is checking information from a text checking understanding from a text, but checking specifically what the text says. You are not checking the ability of the student to digest, understand, digest, and express ideas. Why? Because you are using bottom-up techniques. So your idea here is to know if the student understands general information. So the skill that you're using is very similar to the one you were using with listening. And that's why I think analyzing your test is so important. Why? Because you may encounter that you are evaluating the same skill. And what is the purpose of having a test that is evaluating the same skill over and over and over and over? You have to do it in a certain way that you are testing one thing in one exercise, another thing in another exercise, another thing in another exercise. And before I forget, I'm saying the word exercise because in some of the literature, the word exercise, the word activity, the word task are exactly the same. So I'm using the word exercise as a synonym of activity or task for this purpose, because you know that the word exercise is more associated with a behaviorist position in which is more mechanical. Okay, but in for the purpose of this session and in general, I'm using the word exercise as a synonym of task or as a synonym of activity, which is part of the part of the literature says that they are the same. So I'm not saying something that is wrong, but I wanted to clarify that. So in terms of skill, I was saying that we are using the same as we were using listening. So it's just checking information, checking what is written in the text. And the assessment obviously is going to be if it is correct, full mark, and if it is not correct, nothing. So the strategy is reading and checking for specific information. And why is checking for specific information? Because you are checking if the information is true or false. So there's no gray scale here. It's black or white. But if we go to the other exercise, the other reading exercise, it says, answer these questions about Joshua. First of all, there's no one in Uruguay whose name can be Joshua. So we need to make a smooth transition between one exercise and the other. If you see here, one title says true or false, correct the statements. The other one says answer these questions about Joshua. Personally, I don't like it very much. Why? Because what I would do here is I would say, or I would create like a character and I would say like, you are interviewing Joshua for the school newspaper, if there is a school newspaper where you work. But for example, when I was working in Salto, there was a newspaper or there was a web page. So you can say, imagine you are the Facebook administrator of the school web page and carry out an interview with Joshua and ask him the following questions. And then you can say, answer the questions as if you were Joshua, or imagine you are Joshua and you are asked these questions in an interview. So something that is a little more contextualized than say, answer these questions about Joshua. I think that these titles are not providing a good context for the questions. But as I told you, this is very personal. I do it in this way, but that doesn't mean that you have to do it this way. Sometimes it's better to have these titles because they are more clear for the students. So in this case, the aim of this reading activity also is to check information. 4 out of 5 questions ask for specific information, and one of them is a yes or no question. When you ask a yes or no question, in general, it's almost the same as asking true or false, because you are checking specific information, whether the specific information is in the text or not in the text. So in this case, in this case, the questions that are related to information, what we call WH questions, are very specific about information that is contained in the text. Like, what does Joshua do in his free time? And the answer is that he practices sports. If you go to the previous exercise, it says he doesn't like sports. So you are checking almost the same. Then it says, how are Joshua and his parents going to travel next year? And well, in this case, it's okay. Um, what is he going to do in France? I mean, the questions are very specific about things that are in, for example, in the text, it says, in France, he's going to do this and this and that and that. So actually, the student do not need to transform anything. I mean, they just need to copy from the text. So actually what they are doing here is finding or identifying where the information in the text is. And then what they do is to copy the information into the answer. So what happens here? If they answer what they are asked, the question is correct, and therefore they are not penalized for grammar. And as I said, the strategy here is to find information in the text and copy that information into the answer. If we move to language awareness, I like this particular exercise or this particular task. Why? First of all, because it's communicative. If you remember in our last session, I gave you two examples of language awareness exercises. One of them was very behavioristic, and the other one was very communicative. In this case, it's very communicative. Why? Because the words are given, and you have more words than the ones they need. So in this case, it is communicative because they need to understand the text in order to understand which word fits every space, every blank. So in this case, the activity is truly communicative. That's why I told you in my feedback there. And the aim is to know if the student understands the text. Why? Because if the student does not understand the text, it is obvious that the student is not going to be able to complete the text with the words given. So the aim is to know if the student understands the text and allocate the words. Uh, Obviously, they are working with collocation here because some of the words have a specific collocation, like with prepositions or verbs, etc. And students are working with reading and understanding the text in order to complete, but also they use some rules as well as the meaning. For example, when it says last Saturday, she didn't. When it says she didn't, the student is using a rule. The rule that is using is that in this case, the student cannot use the word decided because the student should know that after a negative in the past, the verb is in infinitive. So obviously, after the student reads didn't, the student has two possibilities, want or work. And until there, it's pretty much grammar based. But then he needs to know when the author says, but last Saturday, she didn't to go out. So in this case, you need to understand the whole idea in the sentence in order to know that the word here should be want. She didn't want to go out. Okay? So the assessment is pretty much clear, but one thing that has happened to me several times with this type of exercises is that when I plan the exercise, everything seems to be so easy for me. But then when I correct, I realize that sometimes two words fit in the same place. And that sometimes happens. I mean, we can make that, it's not a mistake actually, but that sometimes happens. So we need to be pretty flexible in order to accept that these things may happen. So what are the strategies used here? Identifying collocations, reading for understanding, searching for meaning. So there are many strategies that you are checking here. So let's imagine that the student does not fill in this exercise. What does it mean? That you need to work in identifying collocations. You need to work in reading for understanding. You need to work in searching for meaning. What happens if the students complete the reading perfectly? The students are aware of finding information. They have that skill of finding information in the text. However, in this case, I say that this exercise is more challenging than the others because here they truly need to understand the text. So in here, probably when you work in class, you need to plan some activities where they have to work with collocations, where they have to match different parts of a sentence, where they need to do this type of activities where they have to use some words to fill in a text or something like this. But the most important thing is that you need to provide them with the proper scaffolding. And we talked about scaffolding. You need to provide them with different clues in order to improve this. And this is absolutely important. But what happens with writing? Well, in this case, it says choose one of these topics. And you have two topics. The first one says write a paragraph about yourself, include some general information, what you did last weekend, and your plans for next weekend. So in this case, basically, the teacher is asking for three things. First of all, it's asking for general information. Then it's asking for activities from last week and activities for next weekend. So one thing is that when you do these kind of things, you need to add some more information. Or you can say like, for example, this, for example, that. Or you can provide them with some more vocabulary like yesterday or 2 days ago or then. Or you can say, these words can help you and you can give them a bubble with several words. My concern about these two activities, the other activities, write about a sport person you admire, includes this information, name, activities, plan for the future, and duties. My concern about these two activities can be summarized in 2 or 3 points. The first one is that the students don't know what is going to be assessed. So I should include the rubrics for these two activities. This is going to be beneficial for them because they are going to know what is going to be assessed and how they need to do in order to do a good piece of writing. The second aspect is that there are other elements that should be included, like pictures, maybe some lines where the students can write on. You can include like maybe the topic sentence, or you can include some type of scaffolding. The words I told you before, something that provides them with some clues in order to write. Writing is not an easy task. I mean, writing is one of the most difficult ones, and you need to be aware of that. It's not just writing the title and write whatever you need to write. You need to give them clues. Nowadays, with the fact that Inspección is focused on writing, and you have to prepare like 1 or 2 pre-writing activities, this is a little bit solved, a little bit, because what I cannot see sometimes or is that transition from the word level into the sentence level and into the discourse level. Because what happens in this slide, or what happens in this activity, is that from nothing, you are asking the students to write a text, to write a discourse text. So what happens is this. In the first exercise, when they were filling in the blanks, at which level they were? The level of the word, level of the sentence, or the level of the discourse? They were at the level of the word because fill in the blanks with the word you hear. In the second one, true or false, at what level they were? In terms of reading, they were at the discourse level, but in terms of production, they were at the word level. In the third one, that is answer the questions, they were at the sentence level. But what type of sentence? Are they creating the sentences? No, they are copying the sentences because the sentences that they need to write are exactly the way they should be written in the text. What happens in the language awareness exercise? Fill in the blanks with a word. So they are still working at the word level. Obviously, in the last one, is a little there's a little mixture or shifting since they need to understand everything. But at the level of production, they are producing words. And all of a sudden, there is an exercise that says write a paragraph, which is not true because it says write a paragraph about yourself. And then it says general information, what you did last weekend and what you are going to do next weekend. If you pay attention to that, actually what you have to write is 3 paragraphs because you are talking about totally different information. So you need to separate the information into 3 different levels. So that's why I am so concerned with writing. And obviously what you need to work here is process writing. You need to help the students work with editing and obviously scaffolding. As I told you before, scaffolding is essential, and I have the feeling that we are not paying much attention to scaffolding in writing. So, what are the things you need to improve about this test? First of all, and you can go to the next slide that says some things to improve, okay? And the first one says, in this test, the sub-skills and the strategies used are very limited. Why? Because what I told you, you are using the same skill in the first exercise, in the second, and in the third. And then all of a sudden, you are having a writing activity in which you are not providing the student with enough information and support. Then there is a lack of top-down activities or top-down strategies. Why? Because you are basically trying to find information in the text, nothing else. It does not provide appropriate scaffolding in certain areas like writing. It does not provide the students with the criteria for assessment. And that is what I told you when I talked about rubrics, because rubrics are the criteria for any type of exercise that the students are going to perform. Then the titles do not help the students with the transition from one activity to the other. It's what I told you before. It's like true or false. Answer the questions. Do this, do that. But first of all, you need to make a transition from one to the other. In motivation theory, there is a theory by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi who says that when we learn is when we experience flow. And my feeling is that when you do like choose the right answer or true or false, blah, blah, it's like you are doing something and you cut, doing something and you cut, doing something and you cut. And you need to provide something really smooth, a smooth transition from one activity to the other. Then the activities are not contextualized within the student's interest and life. I have the feeling that nobody cares about Joshua's activities. I mean, if you are talking about Diego Lugano's activities, I have the feeling that are going to be more students interested than about Joshua's activities. So sometimes when we select a text, or when we adapt a text, or when we create a text, we need to be very aware of the students' interest. And I have the feeling that the students' interests were not considered in this case. So the information we are going to get from this particular diagnostic test is very limited, because I'm testing almost the same strategy, the same skills. So sorry to tell you, but this is what happens when the plan of our diagnostic test is not very good, like in this case. So what is the information I can get from the diagnostic test? Let's imagine that the students, from the fill in the blanks in the listening activity, and there is a slide. You go to the slide where you find this information. First of all, what you have to remember, what you have to do in this exercise. In this exercise, what you have to do is to listen and write. Listen and write. So the strategy you are using is recognition. So obviously, if the students cannot do it, it's because there is a lack of recognition. They cannot recognize the name, they cannot recognize the sounds, they cannot recognize a word within the flow of the native speaker. Then the other possibility is that they have a lack of association between the phonemes and the graphemes. So they may know what they listen, but then they have an inability to write it. Why the inability to write it? Because they don't know how to transform what they listened into a word. There must be lack of practice. And this is a very hot issue, because how many times do we do listening activities in class? In my experience, that is very limited, because sometimes because we don't have the cassettes or we don't have the CDs. Sometimes because we don't have a socket in our classroom, because we don't have a place where to plug in the radio. Sometimes because, and there are always reasons for this. What happens with the true or false activity? If they cannot answer the true or false activity, what may happen? First of all, as I told you before, here what they are doing is this information, true or false. So what may happen is that they do not understand the sentence in the text. If they do not understand the sentence in the text, obviously they are not going to answer correctly. Or the other way around, they may understand information in the text, but they may not understand the information in the true or false activity. So there must be an inability to find information, because they may not practice. Imagine that you include a lot of top-down activities and the previous teacher did not include top-down strategies or techniques into the test. Obviously, students are going to fail because they don't know. So maybe what you need to focus there is that they need to develop some top-down techniques or strategies. Then they may have a lack of vocabulary, or maybe the text is too difficult. And in order to know if the text is too difficult, there are different ways of knowing whether a text is difficult or not. One of those ideas is an idea that has been shared by our supervisors, and is that if the text has more than 20% of the words that are not known by the students, then the text is not appropriate. There is another rule which is very common here in the United States. That is a 5-finger rule. If you start reading a text and you have one word that you don't know, that your students don't know, another word that your students don't know, another word that your students don't know, another word your students don't know, and another one your students don't know, and the text continues, then that text is not for your students. So you have to pay very much attention to that. Then, what happens if they do not answer the questions correctly? Well, it may happen what we said before, that the text is too difficult, or that the students do not understand the question because they may not have the, the vocabulary to understand the questions. Or maybe the student does not understand how to get the information from the text. Or that the student is unable to write the answer. And I'm going to tell you a short story. I mean, it's a little extreme, but I'm going to tell you anyway because it is extreme but happened to me some years ago. Some years ago, I was working in Villa Constitución, which is a small town in, in Salto. And I remember I had a student who was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I mean, when he spoke, he spoke perfectly. He was having good vocabulary. I mean, excellent. But the day of the test, his tests were one. One, 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 one. Everything was wrong. And not only everything was wrong, but also that there were several parts of the test that were blank. So that called my attention, especially the second time that happened the same. Because the first time I thought, well, maybe he didn't study, maybe the test was very difficult. And I asked him, was the test difficult for you? And he said, no, not at all. So I said, well, maybe he didn't want to do it. Well, to make a long story short, he had a problem in his eyesight. So with this ear, he was seeing the end of the word, and with this one, he was seeing the beginning of the word. Something that could be corrected with a pair of glasses, but nobody paid attention to that. And he was a great student, but there was another reason that was not an ordinary reason. So my suggestion is that whenever you have a student that is a good student in class, try to try to check what's going on with that student or what's going on with the test when the test is a problem for those students. Okay, let's go to the next activity. The next activity is identify the blank for each word. Remember that the next activity was the language awareness. Well, maybe in this case, the student may not know grammar, may not know collocations, may not understand the text. There are different things that you have to pay attention to. What happens in the writing when the student leaves that part blank? I would say that one of the most common reasons for this is the lack of time. Because writing is an activity that takes a lot of time. I would say that at least students need to have 20-25 minutes to write a decent paragraph. So probably the lack of time is one of them. And in this particular case, I would say that the lack of scaffolding was one of the main reasons for them to fail to do this activity. So what happens if the students do not do the test? What might be the reason? Well, what I'm going to say now is very personal again, but the feeling I have is that we don't assign much importance to diagnostic test. We say, okay, today we are going to do a diagnostic test. They do the diagnostic test, but then they don't know what we did with the diagnostic test. So I think we need to share with them what the diagnostic test is for and the information we got from the diagnostic test. And sometimes discussing these activities with them after the diagnostic test may help us understand some aspects. They can tell you, okay, you know, last year with our teacher, we didn't work with this type of activities. Or, you know, teacher, I don't remember the vocabulary to write this type of writing. Or, you know, teacher, I when there is a when there's a listening activity, I get blocked. And you need to understand that. And you need to know that listening is not easy. I'm going to confess you something that is very personal, but I have been living here for 3 years so far. And every time I have to speak on the phone is horrible, horrible. Because I feel really stressed. I think I'm not going to be able to do it. And obviously, then I do it and I have no problems and everything is fine. But this is something that stresses me a lot. And I have a professor who's now in Japan, and he told me that he suffers the same when he has to speak in Japanese. And he speaks Japanese fluently. I mean, his wife is Japanese, his kids are Japanese, so he speaks Japanese as an ordinary language. So, what to do with this information? What to do with this information we get from the test? First of all, if you find that there are problems with listening, you have to expose the students to more listening activities. So they get used to listening in English. And obviously, you have to be coherent between the way you teach and the way you assess. So if you teach them listening activities with bottom up and top down activities, strategies, use bottom up and top down strategies when you assess. If you if you make them listen to the recording twice or three times, make them listen to the recording 2 or 3 times. Do the same as you do in class. Then, what happens if you diagnose that the students are very used to bottom-up activities but not very much accustomed to uh, top-down activities? Well, you have to move from those bottom-up strategies, bottom-up techniques into top-down. You have to vary the layout of the listening activities. Why I'm saying so? Sometimes you can practice with filling the gap like you were doing this time, but then the next time you can do a multiple choice one, or the next time you can do, I don't know, circle the picture. You have to do something that is really different. Train your students to know that the most important aspect when listening is comprehension and not spelling, because sometimes what may happen is that they are nervous or they are stressed because they don't know how to write the word exactly. So tell them it doesn't matter if you write if there are spelling mistakes. Be sure that what you hear is represented in the gap. So try to lower their affective filters. Find authentic listening activities. That is absolutely important. I mean, sometimes we create listening activities that do not make any sense. Then when in terms of reading, well, try to find more attractive texts with a minimum of 80% of the vocabulary known by the students. Find a purpose for reading, because why are they going to read? Just because you are testing reading? Try to find a situation in which it is important for them to read. Try to set a challenge. Try to set a problem-based activity. And be creative with activities you present in the test. In terms of grammar, use grammar communicatively. A good a good example is the one you saw here in the test. Also, expose the students to the use of the language freely. And this is part of communicative approach. This is part of TBL. This is part of the 6 C's approach. This is part of everything. So you need to work with this um, in a free way. Then it says promote the use of problem-based learning. I already told you. Then another aspect that for me is very important is that sometimes the problems with writing are because we do not devote much time to writing in class. And this is one thing that we need to change. If you want your students to write something, okay, use class time to do it. Teach them pre-writing activities. Scaffold your students in order to write. Write the text. Ask them to do some peer correction. Ask them to revise what they write. Give them feedback. I know it takes time, but it really pays off. And finally, set the criteria for assessment. I strongly believe that if you give them the criteria you are going to use to assess your students' knowledge, that is going to be key in the development of their writing skills. So where in my plan I'm so far? That is the next slide. So you have the description of the group, you have the statistics, you have the previous grades, and the social economic background. Then you have the analysis of the diagnostic test, where you say what the deficiencies are, and then you set the objective for the course. So in my course, I'm going to work more on this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that. So you have to, as I said before, now your philosophy of teaching is interacting with the object, or sorry, with the topics that are in the syllabus and with the deficiencies you found in your students. So the three things are mixing up, and you have to create your plan. So what you are going to do next? So after reading the theoretical framework, you are going to write the theoretical part of your plan. That means I'm going to teach in this way. I'm going to use these strategies. I'm going to teach strategies explicitly or implicitly. I'm going to develop this skill, that. So now we are getting into a part that is very important too, and is to design what or which content I'm going to teach during the year and how. And for that, we are going to use the 6Ds approach, which is the approach that we are using in secundaria. Why is called the 6Ds approach? Because there are 6 words that start with a T that are very important in our plan. The theme, and if you pay attention to the theme, what we are going to create are thematic units. Why they are thematic units? Because they go around a theme. And you are going to see that in every syllabus, I mean, in the syllabus for first grade, for second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, you have certain themes. And what happens when you have a theme? You have a theme and you have a text, because Inspección de Inglés said, okay, for sixth grade, we are going to use these themes. And you are going to use speak out. That is the text. But then what we are going to do is to define which topics we are going to use. So this is what you are going to create. And the thematic units are you are so free to do this. You are given the theme, but then the content, you can adapt the content to your students' interest. So this can be something that you create as a teacher, but you can be very diplomatic and very democratic in this way. And you can tell the students, okay, the thematic unit is going to be work. What do you want to know, or what do you want to treat about work? And they are going to tell you how to apply for a job. They are going to tell you how to fill in a form. They are going to tell you how to behave in a work interview, in a job interview, sorry. So you are going to have different topics that are going to be essential for this. So then you are going to create the thread. The thread is how you are going to organize those topics so they make sense. So you are going to start, for example, with something more. Well, I'm going to recap because the recording stopped. But then I was telling you that the threads are going, you have to start from the more general topics into the more concrete. Then you go to the task. What is a task? A task is an activity. So when they say, for example, that they want to be prepared to, to face a job interview, what are the tasks that you are going to create or to design? One can be ask and answer questions. Another one can be a web quest about what is important and not important whenever you go to a job interview. So there are different things that you can do that are called tasks. And then obviously the transition between the different tasks. And I think this is more probably the most important part because the students need to realize that they are working with something that is a unit and not something that is like do this, do that, do that. In the next page, you are going to find an annual plan, which is not actually an annual plan, it's just the organization of the thematic units. And you have the thematic units and you have the theme, the topics, and the text. Obviously, there are transitions, obviously, there are threads, but and obviously there is a text. Sorry. And obviously, there are transitions, transition threads, and tasks. But these ones are in my daily plan and not in my annual plan. So at what stage is my plan now? Is the following slide. So you have the description of the group, all the different things. Then you have the analysis of the diagnostic test. Then you have all the objectives for your course. And you have the theoretical framework. And now, after you have the themes, you have the topics, you created the threads, the text, the transitions, so you have, and the tasks. So you have everything you need. So some things you need to consider when you are talking about your plan is that the plan should be in Spanish. And the example I gave you is in Spanish. Because the plan is not only for you, it's for your students, it's for the parents, it's for everyone. So, and it is a public document inside the register book, which is another public document. Then, this is something we always say, but we never do. I mean, each plan should be different because each group is going to be different. If you consider the analysis of the diagnostic test, you are going to see that what works in one group doesn't work in another one. So you have to consider that. It has to be in your register book all the time. And as it is a plan, the word plan means that it's not something definite. So whenever you administer a test, you should make some adjustments. When you have your midterms in June, July, you need to make some adjustments. So adjustments are part of it. Or let's imagine that the high school decides to do something, to do a fair or to do something. Or now with the strikes, you need to change your plan. Well, you can write with your pen and just modify the things that you want to modify. And your annual plan must reflect what Inspección wants, what your students bring and want, your philosophy of teaching, and a tentative idea of the activities your students are going to perform during the year, plus the interactions with other colleagues and the ways of assessing the students' work. Because one of the things you need to consider is that the plan or that English can work with the different subjects. So you can carry out projects with different subjects and that would be awesome. So In the next slide, you have a possible layout. So you start with the general description of the group, then the analysis of the diagnostic test, then the general objectives of the course, then the objectives to help students improve their deficiencies, then a draft of the plan, the topics, blah, 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 what I gave you in that colorful schema, and then assessment and evaluation. So the task I have for you is, given the thematic unit entertainment, you are going to plan 5 topics related to that thematic unit, and you are going to plan 2 tasks for each topic. So then explain how the activities are connected, the text you are going to use to perform each activity, and the transitions between activities. Okay? And you are going to submit this to Edmodo, and you can do it since there are like 2 or 3 people from each province. Maybe you want to, or you prefer to work in groups or trios, that would be fine. But the idea is that you you can start drafting a thematic unit. We are going to continue working with this in our next session, but at least I want you to have a slight idea of this. Okay? Well, I hope you gain some knowledge from this, and I'll see you on Saturday. And if you have any questions, just ask me. Thank you.